So as we said, today is Labor Day weekend, and this is also the last Sunday in our series on Sabbath. Now, I'm a little bit of a history buff, a history nerd, so as I was preparing for this message, I looked into the history and origins of Labor Day. Maybe you've already heard this, but during the Industrial Revolution of the 1800s, working conditions in factories, railroads, mills, and mines, it was pretty grim. Employees worked long, hard hours in unsafe conditions. They worked 6 days a week, 12 hours a day in crowded and poorly ventilated spaces. This was before child labor laws, so many children even had to labor in those conditions. Supervision was harsh, and punishments, I learned this, punishments were handed out to those who talked or sang as they worked, so you can't even talk to pass the time. So during the late 1800s, labor unions and workers' activists, they began to fight for workers' rights so that they could have safe working conditions and fair pay and more time off. And then on September 5th, 1882, union leaders in New York City organized what is thought to be the first Labor Day parade. So on that first Monday in September, all the workers of the city, the sewers and the seamstress and the factory workers, they all took to the streets on unpaid leave, and they marched through the city. In doing so, they were advocating for shorter hours and safer working conditions. About 12 years later, in 1894, Labor Day was declared a federal holiday by President Grover Cleveland, and we now observe it every Monday, the first Monday of September. It's a way for us to recognize the achievements of American workers and recognize the contributions that so many people have given to make our country what it is today. But of course, these days, most of us can think of Labor Day with barbecues and picnics and the unofficial end of summer. And I thought all this was really interesting, but I found that we tend to think of Sabbath in the same way that we think about Labor Day. Well, let me explain. So the original founders of Labor Day, the union leaders, the workers' rights activists, they struggled and they labored for fair treatment. And through their efforts, the country decided that they had earned this day off. They deserved to have fair and safe working conditions. They had worked very hard and they had deserved their rest. And because they had worked so hard, now they could celebrate and relax and enjoy their achievements. But at the same time, we often think of Sabbath similarly, that we can only take rest once we have earned it. We can only rest because we've deserved it. We might say, well, I can't take a vacation until I've finished this big project that I'm working on. Or we might think, I can only sit down and rest because all the laundry is done and the food has been cooked and the dishes have been put away. Now I can take some time to rest. We feel like we have to be worthy of rest before we can take this time to relax. And similarly, there's a lot of guilt and shame around resting. We sit down to rest, and of course, our mind thinks of all the things that we should be doing, that we could be doing in that moment. We try to relax, but we can't shut our minds off. It's thinking about all the things that need to get done still. We have even been fooled into thinking that exhaustion is normal and that rest is a luxury or a privilege that only a few can have. We've tricked ourselves into believing that Sabbath is selfish and that rest is only given for those who have earned it. It's only given for a job well done. But as we've discovered these last couple of weeks, Sabbath is God's free gift to us. Something that we didn't have to earn, something we didn't have to work for. Sabbath is God's freely given gift of regular rest. It's given for our delight. It's given so that we can have communion with God and fellowship with others. It's a time for being in the midst of our busyness and doing. Rest is not a reward to be earned. It's God's free gift. Now, this was a lesson that the Israelite people had to learn as well. Sabbath was God's free gift to everyone, even those that they may thought didn't earn it or didn't deserve it. So last week we talked about the Sabbath commandment, the fourth commandment of the 10 commandments. And as a reminder to the Israelite people that they were no longer slaves, they were to set apart one day a week for rest. But likewise, they were to extend that same Sabbath rest to those in their midst, to their children, to their servants, even to their livestock, and even to the foreigners living among them. Sabbath was God's free gift to everyone. But God took this Sabbath commandment, the fourth commandment, and extended it even further. Because as Kent read from Deuteronomy chapter 15, God established a Sabbath year every 7th year. This year of the Sabbath, or year of the Lord's release, was a time when all debts were to be canceled, creditors weren't to demand payments, loans were to be forgiven. Sounds pretty nice if you think about it. But of course, you can imagine how that probably went over with the Israelites. Oh, come on, God, are you serious? These people don't deserve to have their debts canceled. They didn't do anything to earn this loan forgiveness. They aren't worthy of this big of a reward. I can see the bankers and the creditors getting all up in arms because they've just lost out on money that they'll never see again. I can hear people saying, well, if they couldn't afford to pay their loan back in 6 years, then they shouldn't have taken it out to begin with. I had to pay back my debt. Why shouldn't they have to do the same? And I imagine that's what the Israelite people were thinking, because I've heard some of those same sentiments in people today. Now, last year, the government proposed a multi-billion-dollar student loan forgiveness program. It hasn't passed yet, but instead of reacting with joy and celebration, oh, that's so great that all these people are going to have their loans forgiven, a lot of people reacted pretty negatively. They said things like, well, I had to pay back my school loans. Why shouldn't other people have to? I had to sacrifice and work hard to pay for my education. And if you're going to choose to go to an expensive school and take out loans, then you need to be responsible for paying that off. In fact, these were actual quotes that I pulled from an NBC News article from April of last year. One person says that, in my day, I paid for my college and so did everyone else I knew. It was my debt. I owned it. The author of this article, after quoting several people, he went on to say, perusing the social media comments on nearly every story about loan forgiveness reveals a dark jealousy, bitterness, and animosity toward those who are being given a taste of much-needed financial relief. And I think the general idea for people was the concept of fairness. I had to repay my loans. It's only fair that everybody else should have to as well. It's unfair that I had to make sacrifices, work extra jobs, sacrifice for my education, and others won't have to do the same. So when God declares for the Israelites this year of Sabbath, this year of loan forgiveness, I'm pretty sure that many of the Israelites felt the same way. God, this isn't fair. Why should their loans be forgiven? Why should their debts be canceled? And in fact, as we read, the author of Deuteronomy even anticipates that this is going to be how people respond. Because he says, watch yourself. Be careful that you do not entertain a mean thought thinking, well, the 7th year, the year of remission is near, and therefore you view your needy neighbor with hostility and give them nothing. God told people to give generously, even to those who would never be able to pay it back. Open your hand and give to people, give to the needy. Don't resent them. And I think there's a lot of times in our lives where we also want to scream, that just isn't fair. But as I've learned through my life, the thing about God is that God isn't fair. God's forgiveness isn't fair. God's grace isn't fair, because none of us deserve God's love, but God gives it anyway. None of us could possibly do enough to earn God's grace, but God gives it freely. And while we may have this misconception that we have to work first before we can earn Sabbath, God says that it is a free and undeserved gift. This gift of Sabbath is for everyone, the poor and the rich, the young and the old, the hard workers and the ones who are lazy and have slacked off. Sabbath tells us that God isn't fair. And of course, that leads to the story of the prodigal son, which I read just a few moments ago. This story is one of the most powerful examples of God's grace found in the whole Bible. This story tells us that God isn't fair. And you may have heard the story before. We are familiar with it. The rebellious son runs away from home, blows his father's hard-earned money, and around that same time, a famine strikes the land. The only work he can get is laboring in the fields. This was, a day before labor unions and workers' rights laws. And as a Jew, this was one of the most demeaning and humiliating jobs he could take. More than that, I imagine that working in the fields, caring for pigs, it didn't allow for a whole lot of rest. He was in a country that didn't practice Sabbath. And there's no time for Sabbath when you're poor, when you're laboring. So this young man found himself working hard every single day, starving with nothing to eat. His mind wandered back to his father's house. He remembered that even the hired hands and the servants were always given enough food to eat. Even the hired hands and servants were always treated fairly, given a bed to sleep in. Sure, he might have to work some, but at his father's house, he would also have time for rest. He would have time for Sabbath. So he comes to his senses and decides to return home, but he knows that he no longer deserves to be called his father's son. But this is where grace comes in. This is where we learn that God is not fair, because the text tells us that while the young man was still a long way off, his father saw him, was moved with compassion. His father ran out to him and hugged him and kissed him. Even though this wayward son did nothing to deserve his father's love and grace, the father freely gave it. And even though he began to say, "Father, I no longer deserve to be called your son," the father wasn't hearing it. He said, "No, son, it's time to party. It's time to celebrate. Let's bring out the fattened calf, get some fresh clothes on him, bring the nicest robes and put them on him, because my son was lost and is now found." This is just one of the best stories of what God's grace looks like for each of us. This is a picture of an unfair God. But of course, the older son makes an appearance at the end of the story, voicing, I think, what many of us would be thinking as well. This isn't fair. My younger brother did nothing to deserve all of this. In fact, what he deserves is punishment, not a party. I am the one who worked hard. I am the one who labored and sacrificed all these years. I am the one who should be celebrated, not him. But God isn't fair. All are invited to the party. And God's grace is lavished upon us, whether we deserve it or not, whether we feel we have earned it or not. Now, like the older brother, we too are often tempted to measure our worth and measure our value by how much we earn, by how much we produce, by what we have done to deserve rest. But the beauty of God's Sabbath rest is that it tells us our value is not determined by how productive or how successful we are, by how much we make, by how hard we work. Instead, Sabbath tells us that all are worthy of rest. All are worthy of grace and love. God's Sabbath brings us from a place of slavery into a place of freedom, from death to life, from simply surviving and trying to get by one day to the next, to thriving and flourishing. And Sabbath tells us we are to bring everyone else along with us too, because everyone is invited to the party. You are enough, is what Sabbath tells us. You are worthy of rest. Now, a couple weeks ago when we began this series, I said that I am preaching to myself just as much to anybody else. This has been a hard lesson for me to learn in my life. Last year, I was taking a class in seminary on spiritual practices, and 1 week we talked about Sabbath. We learned about the practice of Sabbath rest. And each week we had to keep a journal. So I went back and looked at my journal, and I read what I wrote, and here's what I had said. My biggest discovery this week is that I don't have to do anything to earn or deserve the gift of Sabbath and the gift of rest. So many times I think, well, I'd like to take a nap, but let me finish this homework assignment, or I better get a start on next week's sermon first. Or alternatively, I might believe I only deserve rest because I worked really hard that day, because I got a lot done. I often feel like I have to earn the right and privilege even just to rest. But like God's grace, which is freely given, this divine gift of Sabbath rest is freely given to us as well. So as we saw, the parable of the prodigal son ends with a party. It ends with a celebration feast. And likewise, I like to picture the Sabbath as a huge celebration feast where everyone is invited. Sabbath says all are welcome to come, to sit at the table, to relax, to rest in God's presence. Maybe we can think of Sabbath like the best Labor Day barbecue ever. I think of, going over to a friend's house. I like to cook, but I think there's nothing as special as when someone has cooked a homemade meal just for you. And you sit at the table and they serve it to you and you say, is there anything I can do? Can I help you clean up? And they say, no. Just relax. You are our guest. And in the same way, I think that that's what communion looks like. Communion is this celebration Sabbath feast where everyone is invited to the party, where God brings us to the table and says, come on up, pull up a seat, sit down and relax. I've prepared this just for you. Through communion, we are invited into God's grace. We are invited into Sabbath rest. And through communion, we remember that we don't need to do anything to earn, to deserve God's grace. It's freely given to all. All are welcome to come.